Доброго дня, з вами студія Артур Корнієнко, і у нас сьогодні унікальний гість. Журналіст, який працював у багатьох гарячих точках, був волонтером у самої Матері Терези, а останні 35 років працює на Радіо Ватикану. Знайомтесь, професор комунікації і керівник англомовної редакції Радіо Ватикану Sean Patrick Lovett. Welcome, Sean. It's good to have you with us.
Thank you, and thanks for the pronunciation of Sean Patrick Lovett. You say it so well.
It's a beautiful name to pronounce. So.
You're very kind. Thank you, Arthur.
2 years ago here, you said that Vatican is very careful in adopting new media because they're often uncontrollable. Also, you shared that every pope uses media in the way that is most suited to the moment in history. How has Vatican's media advanced to the current moment in history?
I said all that?
Yes, last time you were here.
That's interesting.
And so how has Vatican's media advanced to the current moment in history and how Pope Francis uses them?
Okay. There are lots of questions in one there. The Vatican media has not advanced. It is advancing. We have had several media commissions working on how to make that advance, and they're still working, even at the time of this interview. We're waiting for the results of the latest media commission to see how to bring together the Vatican media. It's sometimes a little bit more complicated than it seems. How long would you like my answer to be?
Well, normal length.
Not a lecture, but an answer. But if I were to sit down and explain to you how complex the Vatican media is, that would take the whole of this interview. When you talk about Vatican media, you talk about a Vatican newspaper, a Vatican radio, a Vatican television, a Vatican press office, a Vatican printing press, a Pontifical Council for Social Communications, a Vatican Internet Office. These are the Vatican communications. So it's a highly complex machine which until now has worked fairly independently one from the other. And what we're trying to do is to make them work better together.
Do you think that reform should be radical, or you should just adjust them in some way?
I don't think people should lose their jobs, if that's what you mean by radical.
No, I mean just the technologies should change radically.
I do believe that we have to follow the technological advances, and we have to see where they lead us. We have to do so with prudence. You can't just run after the next fashion and say, oh, today everybody's on Instagram, so let's get on Instagram. Just because it's there doesn't mean that it's useful and that it's good. And I think those are the two criteria we try to apply. Is it useful? Does it help people get the message? And is it good? Is it good for humanity? Is it good for the Holy See? Does it help the Pope to get his message out? That's what we have to look at every time.
Okay. Carlo Maria Martini, the Archbishop of Milan and the candidate for the Holy See in 2005, has said that Church is 200 years behind. Liberals in the Church raise many controversial issues like celibacy, divorce, contraceptives, homosexuality, just to name a few. Pope Francis is committed to dialogue, and yet the Church's stance on all these issues remains the same. It is unchanged. And yet, Pope is considered to be very progressive, generally considered very progressive. He's often called the master of ambiguity by critics, admirers alike. How has this style of communication of the new Pope influenced the work of Vatican's media?
Again, lots of issues in one. I'm trying to focus on how to answer in a simple and concrete way. First of all, as a communications person, I'm scared of labels, Arthur. So I'm scared of talking about liberals and conservatives and progressives and labeling, saying this Pope is progressive, the previous Pope was conservative. They're always very limiting. My experience is that the Pope maybe seem to be progressive on some things, but he's very conservative on other things. And yes, it's true, the liberals make a lot of noise about some of the issues you mentioned, but the conservatives make a lot of noise about the issues on the other side. So let's clear the table, shall we, of the labels and say, what is the Church doing? How is the Church trying to reach out to people? Because that's the new thing. This is what Pope Francis is inviting us to do. He's saying we need to look outward and not inward. We need to be reaching out to people. And of course, We must use whatever technology is available to do that. We need to be a compassionate church. He uses the word merciful. He also uses the word tender, which is a strange word to use, because we associate tender with being like a mother. But then isn't that what the church is? A mother. So the teaching does remain the same. Yes, it's a 2,000-year-old teaching. We have a big word for it. We call it the magisterium. The teaching cannot change. It's there. But the way we present that teaching and the way we welcome and include and love people and bring them to understand that teaching, that's new. That is changing. And we're using the media to help us to do that.
What has also changed is the Pope's activity in international issues. He helped to restore diplomatic connections between Cuba and the United States. Also, he encourages peace talks between Israel and Palestine. Pope St. John the 23rd also was active in international issues. He was courageous enough to deal with them during the Cold War. What do you think? Pope Francis's activity will increase as we enter the times of even greater instability?
I cannot read Pope Francis' mind. I don't think that specifically playing a role on the political stage is important to him. I think what's important to him is to bring people together, to reconcile different sides. Again, with that word compassion or mercy, to concretely show that God loves everybody, whether you live in America or you live in Cuba. God loves you just the same, and the church welcomes you just the same. His role indirectly affects politics and affects the decisions that politicians make. Because of who he is and the way he does things, he is gaining a credibility that many politicians don't have. How many non-Catholics I meet around the world who say, "Oh, you're from the Vatican," or "I'm not Catholic, but I love your Pope." "I don't go to church. I don't believe in God, but hey, your Pope is so cool." And that's new. We haven't heard that for a long, long time, that our Pope is cool and you're listening to him. That's what's new, is that people are listening to the Pope and they're listening to the church. And that gives us a lot of hope.
So the media changes correspondingly, yes? Also, your media also becomes, your message also changes in the way that Pope Pope changes this message.
The medium is the message, and that's
the media, the Vatican radio, the internet pages you have, they also change accordingly to the style of Pope's communication.
Very much. I've worked with 5 popes, each one very different. We won't go into ancient history and talk about Pope Paul VI, because most people won't maybe even remember who he is. John Paul I was only 33 days, so most people don't remember him, which is a pity, because he was a wonderful pope in 33 days. And a lot of what Pope Francis is doing now, John Paul I was doing over 30 years ago. But certainly John Paul II had his communication style, which was a very visual style, a pope of gesture, the pope who went out into the world. And so our job as media was to run after him and to follow him and to show where he was and what he was doing. Benedict XVI, an intellectual pope, the professor pope, we had to explain a lot of what Benedict XVI was doing, explain why he was the pope of words, and not everybody understood what he was saying. Francis is both. He is the Pope of Word and the Pope of Gesture. He also takes some explaining, because not everybody understands where he's coming from, and he gets pulled one way or the other according to where the interest lies. So what we're seeing in some secular media is that people will say, "He's mine. He's our Pope. He says everything that we want." And then on the other side, they say, no, he's mine. He says everything that we want. So you have to listen carefully to Francis, and you have to look carefully, and you will see that his actions correspond with his words, and that he's not over here or over there. He's right down the middle.
Since you were last here in Ukraine, the country has changed. There was a revolution,
Very much.
annexation of Crimea, the war in the east, economical difficulties. How has Vatican Radio reflected to the events in Ukraine?
We try to cover the events in Ukraine as closely as possible. We are very fortunate because we have personal contacts here. And this is a case where the personal contact with UKU, with the Catholic University, and knowing people here and knowing students who we have a wonderful relationship with the university. We have interns every year who come from UKU to Vatican Radio and work in my department. So there's a personal contact. And that was very important, Arthur, because I work with a team of people at Vatican Radio, and there are many things happening in the world, not just in Ukraine. Unfortunately, many horrible things happening. There are many wars. There are many ugly things happening in different parts of the world. And one of the reasons why my team was particularly interested in covering Ukraine was because we have a personal relationship. And so they were saying, oh, there's Bogdan. What is he doing in Maidan? And Bogdan would be sending us reports directly. And we, because of the personal relationship, we knew we could trust that person. And that became very important in our coverage of what was happening in the country and what is still happening in the country. We trust certain people, they have credibility, and I think that allows us to give a certain kind of coverage that you will not see on other radios or other television stations.
So the Vatican Radio and the Vatican's media in general still return to Ukraine, still cover the situation, because perhaps the interest of the world media has came down in like a year last year, because the situation didn't change mostly, but it maybe it was the same, and nothing changed, and the media's interest to this, it got down. How about Vatican's media?
I think because, again, of the personal interest that we have, we do come back to see, and not just in Ukraine, we try to follow up situations. We make an effort not to be like secular media that jumps from one place to the next, from one war, from one crisis to the next, and then, so there's a crisis in Somalia. So we follow that for 2 months, and then you switch, then Ebola breaks out in Liberia, and so you jump to Liberia, and people think, so they resolved the crisis in Somalia. No, they didn't. It's still going on. But now the crisis of Ebola is finished in Liberia. So we jump to somewhere else. We try to come back and say, excuse me, what's been happening meanwhile? And it's the same thing here. We come back to Ukraine and say, excuse me, what's going on? Are there any betterments? Are there any improvements? What is happening on the ground? So it's a desire to follow up on the story and to update people on the story and to let them know that the situation is still there and it's not resolved, because it's not.
And it is the first time that Ukrainian journalists have to face an armed conflict on their land. As a war correspondent, what would you advise on covering the situation?
That's the question of all questions, isn't it? How do you deal with propaganda? How do you
speak with people that support maybe the hostile side, that are victims of humanitarian crisis? It's very hard.
It's very hard, Arthur, because a journalist ideally, there's a phrase in Latin. The Romans were very clever. They had a phrase for everything. And the Latin phrase is super partes. To be super partes in Latin means to be above the roles, above the parts, to be objective. Literally, we would translate it by objective. A journalist is supposed to be objective. A journalist is supposed to report on what he or she sees is happening. And so is supposed to report on both sides and to allow people to express their opinions. and give sufficient balance and provide sufficient facts and information in a sufficiently clear, concrete, concise, credible and creative way that the viewer or the consumer can get a clear picture of the situation and make up their mind in that regard.
However, there is an argument which people say that people argue, should journalists criticize, to which extent should journalists criticize the government, our government, Ukrainian government, and especially the military leadership, because the situation in Ukraine is not stable. And in these dire circumstances, there's a question of how to be objective considering these dire circumstances, or to try to sustain stability of the state. What
Journalists are not social workers. Mm-hmm. Journalists should not ideally belong to any political party. It sounds very tough, huh? You have the opposition in the country. You have the government, and then you also have the opposition. It's the job of the opposition to criticize and contradict the government. It's the job of the journalist to make sure that everybody knows what the different sides are saying and to verify what they're saying. So to provide their public with information that shows the truth or the lie behind what either side is saying, whether it is government or whether it is opposition.
Ukraine is also a victim of informational war. In your lecture, you said that new media provide answers to questions like who, when, what, and where, but don't explain why. And in this response to this why, that you see the mission of Vatican Radio, you urge people to think, to look for answers.
So does your university.
Yes.
That is exactly what they teach you to do here.
But there is a but. Russian media also suggests their why, its own versions of what is happening, in the style of conspiracy theories, and they justify the government's actions by this why, by this explanation, and manipulate the society. Many analysts call the modern Russia the most advanced implementation of the ideas of postmodernism, because they use the positive ideas of multiple opinions, of many channels of information for their government's good, to promote their ideas. Have the Russian media become more progressive than the most experienced one, the Vatican's media? And does effective mean progressive?
I really don't think I have enough knowledge to compare Russian media to Vatican media, and I don't think it's even fair to compare the two, because we have a very different mission. Our mission statement is completely different. I can speak in terms of the Vatican media. Our mission statement is very clear, and that is to communicate to the greatest number of people in the most effective way, as quickly as possible, the message of the Pope and the Vatican and the Church to the world, in order that the world may become a more just and a more united world. That is the purpose. I know what my mission statement is. You'd have to ask a Russian journalist what their mission statement is.
Where their message is to transfer their message, the message that is good for the government, and they're using informational warfare to spread this information. And how a country should deal with informational war? Should we respond with a blow or turn the other cheek?
Neither. It's the old question, Arthur. Do you respond to propaganda with more propaganda? Do you respond to a lie with an even bigger lie? Do you fight fire with fire? And is that not a very risky thing to do if you do? Because you risk creating such a big conflagration that in the end everybody burns? Or do you try to throw water on the fire? And is water do you not combat lies with truth It's the choice. It's the opposites. Huh? The only thing that you can combat lies with is truth. And if propaganda is lies, the only weapon you have at your disposal is truth. It's the water that you throw on the fire. And so for every lie, you provide a fact, and you try to balance out and to show the facts and the truth that denies the lie. It's a very painful process. It's a very lengthy process. There's no guarantee of success, but there's no alternative, because we believe in the truth, and we can only proclaim the truth. We have no alternative.
But I think the problem is that the Russian propaganda machine is enormous. They invest billions of dollars in their media, and Ukraine, for example, has very limited budget, and their Ukrainian media are just starting to get more advanced. And how it is possible for such a country as Ukraine to deal with such a great propaganda machine as Russia?
Arthur, it's starting here, right now. It's starting here in this studio. Here we are, right here. There you are. It's starting with you. It's starting in this studio. It's starting in this university. It must start somewhere, and it starts small. But there were 40 students listening to me earlier today. If each one of them got that message, that's 40 students who will go out into the world and will produce 40 messages. And if each one of them tells that message to another 40 people, how many does that multiply into? It must start somewhere. It begins small, but it will grow. I believe that. I must believe that.
In a recent report on modern Russia by Peter Pomerantsev and Michael Weiss, they have an assertion that Russia weaponizes the information, and not only that, it also weaponizes culture by the name of the Russian Orthodox Church, which has become a tool of ideological manipulation and aid and justification to government's actions. The Islamic State also uses media in a most horrific way to spread its influence, promote its ideas, and to terrorize. Thousands of European-born joined the ranks of jihadists in the name of jihad. Do the Vatican's media do enough to help resist the new threats of Russian propaganda and Islamic State? And what can the Vatican media do to try to somehow diminish this influence in Europe?
Yes. What is enough? Is enough ever enough? That is a philosophical question to which there is no answer. Enough is never enough. That's the answer to the first question. Mm-hmm. The second question is that it is not the role of the Vatican media to counter propaganda. That's not what it does. The role of the Vatican media is to help the Pope and the Church get its message out to the world. And its message is a message of love and mercy and compassion and peace and understanding and brotherhood and solidarity and these beauty and justice and honesty, and these are the words, these are the messages, these are the core messages. Whether these messages get home, get to where they need to be, doesn't always depend on the messenger. The messenger does his or her best to deliver the message. But then there are ears that will not hear, there are eyes that will not see, and that is as far as you can go. You have to leave God to do something, you know. God has to enter and do his job too, and his job is to take that message and make sure that it gets to where it needs to be.
There are many talks about creating an international institution that would monitor the media and be a authority, ethical, moral authority, and would rank the media according to its truthfulness,
its credibility.
Its credibility, yes. And maybe the Vatican can be such a authority, a moral authority in the world of media that would suggest what is credible, what is not credible, what media are doing the right job on.
That's very kind of you to offer the Vatican in such an important and prestigious role.
Maybe
but Pope Francis, if he was sitting where I'm sitting here, would smile he's very tactile, so he'd probably go, thank you, Arthur, thank you very much. But who are we to judge?
see. And many people in Eastern Europe treasure the inspiring broadcast of Cardinal Tomasz Pidlik to the people behind the Iron Curtain in the Cold War. Maybe Vatican Radio and Vatican Media should probably also renew such broadcasts to the people in east of Ukraine or just the Eastern Europe to spread this message.
We do have a Ukrainian program. We have many East European language programs, and I don't speak any of them, but I do know the people who are responsible for those programs, and I trust that most of them are trying to do precisely that. But the Church is a universal organization, and we consider everyone a child of God, and so the concern for Vatican Media is literally for everyone around the world, whether they're living in Africa or living in Asia or wherever. If I may tell you one very small story to illustrate that, I was in a refugee camp in Angola. Angola is in Central East Africa, and this refugee camp is near the Congo and South Sudan. So there are many refugees coming through all the time. There are many refugee camps. In visiting this camp, in which there really is nothing, no structures, no nothing, I spoke to some young people, younger than you are, who told me that they listen to the radio. It's all they have. They have no other media is available, just the radio. One radio, a little plastic radio, which they keep under a tree, and the aerial goes up into the tree. And on that radio, they listen to the voice of Pope Francis. And these are the programs that my program produces that are rebroadcast by local radios in Uganda. And they said, every time the Pope speaks about us, we feel less invisible. So it's a mission, it's an incredible mission that goes beyond borders of any kind. And that's not limited to Europe or to any nation or to any, it literally is to all nations, to all peoples, to all languages. It's a big job, believe me.
Thank you, Sean, for an interesting interview and for the work that you do.
Thank you for your very interesting questions and for the work that you will do.
Thank you. Нагадую, що ми спілкувалися з Шоном Патріком Лаветом, керівником англомовної редакції Радіо Ватикану. З вами був Артур Корнієнко. Дякую за увагу та до нових зустрічей.